Did you know that one of the most famous pirates in history was a widow from China in the 1800s? Zheng Yi Sao, also known as Jing Shi, was the leader of a powerful pirate confederation that terrorized the South China Sea in the early 1800s. Although history describes her to be a powerful figure, she started from very humble beginnings. Before becoming a pirate, Zheng Yi Sao was born into poverty, but worked her way up to becoming the manager of a brothel in Guangdong. In 1801, at the age of 26, she married a powerful pirate named Zheng Yi. After his sudden death in 1807, Zheng Yi Sao took control of her husband's confederation, which thrived under her management. Her fleet grew greatly to the point that during the years of her reign, multiple armies such as the British and Portuguese could not defeat her. This came to an end, however, when some of the fleet's commanders defected to more legitimate institutions and made the Confederate weaker. After years of being hunted on the high seas, Zheng Yi Sao surrendered but did not face any heavy punishment whatsoever and lived a relatively peaceful life until her death in 1844. Have you ever laughed so hard it began to spread around town like a wildfire? Well, that's exactly what happened on January 31st, 1962, in the village of Kashasha, Tanzania. The laughter began among 3 students in a mission-run boarding school for girls before spreading throughout the school, affecting 95 of the 159 pupils, all of whom were aged between 12 and 18. The teaching staff remained unaffected and reported that students were unable to focus on their lessons. The symptoms of the hysteria lasted for a few hours to 16 days and included fainting, crying, respiratory problems and screaming, all on top of the uncontrollable laughter. Eventually, the laughing epidemic spread to the surrounding areas. 18 months after the epidemic started, the phenomenon finally died off, having forced a temporary closure of 14 schools and affecting around 1,000 people. The cause for the outbreak is unknown, but some theorize that the hysteria was stress-induced due to the high expectation among teachers and parents for the students. Would you believe the things this soldier did while under the influence of dangerous substances during war? On the 18th of March 1944, while on a ski patrol, Aimo Koivunen, a Finnish soldier, and his team were ambushed by Soviet forces. While making their escape, Koivunen was forced to ski faster to survive. Koivunen was supplied with a dangerous stimulant called Pervitin and was advised to take 1 pill per day to suppress appetite and remain awake. Feeling fatigued, Koivunen decided to take the stimulant. Struggling to take just 1 tablet while escaping, Koivunen swallowed his entire supply, giving him a burst of energy before he entered a state of delirium and lost consciousness. Koivunen awoke later and found himself separated from his patrol with no supplies. In the following days, he escaped Soviet forces again and was severely injured by a landmine, setting a Soviet base aflame. Koivunen lay in a ditch for a week but was eventually rescued. With a heart rate of 200 BPM, 3 times faster than the average and weighing just 43 kilograms, Koivunen went on to live a happy life until he passed away at the age of 71. To be or not to be? That is the question. William Shakespeare, also referred to as the Bard of Avon or simply the Bard, was an English playwright, poet and actor from the Elizabethan era. At the age of 18, Shakespeare married 26-year-old Anne Hathaway, who was already pregnant with Susanna, their first child. A few years later, he moved to London and started a successful career which included being a part owner of an acting company called The King's Men, who performed at the Globe Theatre. The original Globe Theatre burned down after a cannon shot started a fire in the thatch roof. Between 1590 and 1613, he wrote roughly 37 dramatic works, including 17 comedies, 10 history plays, and a collection of 154 sonnets. Shakespeare wore a gold hoop earring, bought the largest house in Stratford, was a favourite of King James I, and even had his own coat of arms, a symbol representing his family. At the age of 49, Shakespeare is believed to have retired to Stratford, where he died 3 years later. Did you know frogs played a big role in the invention of batteries? During the early days of electrical research, it was common to use a frog galvanoscope to detect electrical currents, an invention by Luigi Galvani, which was an electrical instrument used to detect voltage that was made of skinned frogs' legs. They believed that frogs made a great material for creating a battery since they are small, easily handled, and especially sensitive to electrical currents. The first frog battery was a chain of 10 frogs created by Eusebio Valli in the 1790s. Refusing to believe in the concept of animal batteries, Alessandro Volta worked to prove that animals weren't needed to create electricity by inventing the voltaic pile, which was the world's first electrical battery in 1799. Despite the animal electricity being debunked, it did not stop physicists from attempting to experiment with the concept. The first successful frog battery was made by Carlo Matteucci and was made from a pile of 14 frog thighs, and despite doubts, the battery was sufficiently powerful enough to decompose potassium iodide. The Knights Templar, a Catholic military order based out of Jerusalem. Originally known as the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ and the Temple of Solomon, the group was one of the most wealthy and popular Christian military orders. Officially backed by the Roman Catholic Church, Templar Knights wearing their white cloaks with a red cross were among the most skilled fighters during the Crusades. The Crusades were a series of religious wars between Christian and Muslim armies during the medieval period. Rumours about the Templars' secret initiation ceremony created distrust, spurring King Philip IV of France, who was already in debt to the Templar Order, to take action against them. He pressured Pope Clement to arrest many of the Order's members in France, forcing false confessions and burning members at the stake. In 1312, under continued pressure from the French king, Pope Clement was ultimately forced to disband the Knights Templar for good. Could there be some truth to cats actually having 9 lives? The story goes that in 1941, during World War II, a black and white tomcat found himself aboard the German Bismarck battleship. During a military operation, the Bismarck sank after a fierce sea battle, leaving the tomcat alone in the waters of the North Atlantic Ocean. Several hours later, the crew of the British HMS Cossack rescued the tomcat, who had survived by climbing onto some wreckage. Unaware of the cat's original name, the crew of the Cossack named him Oscar. Oscar would serve aboard the Cossack for a few months until the ship was severely damaged by a German submarine. After a failed mission to save the ship, crewmen brought Oscar to a military establishment in Gibraltar. Now nicknamed Unsinkable Sam, the cat was transferred aboard the British HMS Ark Royal, but found no luck as the ship was soon torpedoed. The Ark Royal was the last of Oscar's sea adventures, but was not the end of his tale. Oscar was relocated to the Home for Sailors in Belfast, where he later died in 1955. Have you heard the tale of the wealthy landowner who decided to give it all up to become a pirate? Stede Bonnet was a noble who was born into a wealthy family in 1688. He inherited his father's estate when he died, and at the age of 21, he married fellow noble Mary Allenby. Around 7 to 8 years later, he decided to leave his comfortable life, his wife and 2 children behind to purchase a ship he would name Revenge, and turn to a life of piracy. The cause of why he did this is unclear, but some would call it an act triggered by a midlife crisis. With his ship and paid crew, he proceeded to travel the region, capturing and burning other vessels that had the misfortune to sail into the same path as Bonnet's ship. Bonnet got severely injured when he was en route to Nassau, but met the infamous pirate Blackbeard when they docked. Seeing that he was injured and incapable of leading his crew, he temporarily ceded his command to the more capable Blackbeard. He was later captured by soldiers and was hanged on the 10th of December in 1718 at the age of 30. On May 19, 1845, a British expedition was launched from Greenhithe, Kent, and sailed towards Canada in order to find the fabled Northwest Passage. The doomed voyage, led by Captains John Franklin and James Fitzjames, consisted of 2 reinforced ex-Navy warships that were manned by roughly 130 men. Unfortunately for the crew, their cheap food cans caused lead poisoning, while many others dealt with scurvy and the mental effects of isolation. To make matters worse, while travelling through unmapped areas, the 2 ships became trapped in ice near King William Island. In 1848, after over a full year of being icebound in grueling and freezing conditions, the 2 ships were abandoned, by which point Captain John Franklin and nearly 24 others had died. The remaining men, led by Francis Crozier and Fitzjames, set out for the Canadian mainland, and presumably all perished. In the years that followed, searchers found disturbing evidence of what became of the crew, with signs pointing towards mutiny and even cannibalism. In 2014 and 2016, nearly 200 years later, the shipwrecks of the 2 ships HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were finally found. Have you ever claimed to have bad luck? In 1911, Argentinian-born Violet Jessup began working as a stewardess for the White Star ship RMS Olympic. Not long after the ship departed from Southampton, England, it collided with the British warship HMS Hawke, though thankfully no one was killed. The following year, at age 24, Jessup boarded the RMS Titanic, again serving as stewardess. When the Titanic struck the infamous iceberg in the North Atlantic Ocean, Jessup was ordered aboard Lifeboat 16 after helping non-English speakers. 4 years later, during the First World War, Jessup was serving aboard the HMHS Britannic, the sister ship of the Titanic. Following an explosion that was later revealed to have been caused by a sea mine, Jessup boarded one of the lifeboats. Unfortunately, Jessup had to jump into the water to avoid the still spinning propellers that were smashing other lifeboats to pieces, and while making her escape, Jessup was sucked into the propeller's path, but miraculously survived, though she did suffer a head injury. Jessup continued to work for the White Star Company despite it all, and would live on to the age of 83, passing away in 1971. In 1932, Amelia Earhart became the first female aviator to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. 5 years later, Earhart attempted a round-the-world flight along with her navigator, Fred Noonan. Born in Atchison, Kansas in 1897 to a mother who did not wish to raise her daughters as nice little girls, Earhart had developed a passion for adventure at a young age. In her 20s, Earhart continued her search for adventure by gaining flying experience as a pilot, and in 1932 she became the first female pilot to cross the Atlantic Ocean. In March 1937, Earhart attempted to fly around the world, and after making significant headway, she experienced trouble when taking off from Pearl Harbor when her plane's landing gear collapsed, ending her first attempt. A few months later in June, Earhart and her navigator Fred Noonan departed from Miami, Florida, and this time traveled west to east due to better flying conditions. After leaving Lae Airfield in New Guinea, the pair headed towards Howland Island, but mysteriously and unfortunately, they were never seen again. On December 18, 1900, the Flannan Isles lighthouse on Island Moor was found abandoned, with the three keepers nowhere to be seen. 3 days prior, a ship called the Arctur noticed that the unlit lighthouse should have had its light on due to the poor weather conditions. Once the Northern Lighthouse Board was notified, a relief vessel called the Hesperus was sent and arrived after a short delay on December 26th. They found that the flagpole was missing its flag and that food crates had not been prepared for restocking, but most alarming of all was that the keepers were not there to greet them. Joseph Moore, an off-duty lighthouse keeper, was sent ashore alone and found that the front gate was unlocked, the beds were unmade, and the clocks were unwound. 3 crewmen from the Hesperus volunteered to man the lighthouse, while the ship's captain sent the following telegram. A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannans. The 3 keepers, Ducat, Marshall, and the Occasional, have disappeared from the island. The clocks were stopped, and other signs indicated that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows. They must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane. On Thanksgiving Eve in 1971, a mystery man boarded a plane flying from Portland, Oregon to Seattle and made a claim that threatened the lives of everyone on board. The mystery man, commonly referred to as D.B Cooper, actually identified himself as Dan Cooper before boarding the 30-minute flight and used cash to pay for his one-way ticket. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper ordered a bourbon and soda before handing a note to Florence Schaffner, a flight attendant. Schaffner assumed it merely contained a lonely businessman's phone number and decided not to look at it. Cooper then leaned toward her and whispered, "Miss, you better take a look at that note. I have a bomb." Cooper then showed Schaffner his supposed bomb in a briefcase before making a demand for $200,000, 4 parachutes, and a fuel truck on standby where the plane would land in Seattle. The ransom money was assembled and the passengers were dropped off before the plane once again took to the air, this time with just Cooper and some of the crew. A short while into the nighttime flight, the crew of the cockpit became aware that the cabin door had been opened, revealing that Cooper had made his jump from the plane. Cooper was never seen again. In the summer of 1962, 4 prisoners attempted a daring escape from Alcatraz Island, a maximum security prison meant to house America's most dangerous criminals. Alcatraz, or the Rock as it was commonly referred to, was known to house some of history's most infamous felons, including the notorious gangster Al Scarface Capone, who served a 4-year sentence in the 1930s for tax evasion, despite all his other criminal activities, and was even granted a double unique cell with nice furniture. In 1962, 4 inmates, Clarence and John Anglin, Frank Morris, and Alan West, devised a plot to escape from the island using an array of unique and innovative methods. Using metal spoons and discarded saw blades, they scratched their way out of their cells and established a makeshift workshop in the space behind the walls, where they constructed and hand-stitched a raft from over 50 raincoats. The 4 also crafted and placed dummy heads in their beds made of soap, toothpaste, and toilet paper to not arouse suspicion. Alan West was not able to fit through his escape tunnel and was left behind, while the remaining 3 launched their raft and were never seen again. On December 4, 1872, an American merchant ship was found adrift near the Azores with no one on board and no trace of what happened. 1 month prior, on November 5th, the Mary Celeste set sail from New York on its way to Genoa, Italy, carrying a cargo of denatured alcohol. Before leaving New York, the captain, Benjamin Briggs, wrote to his mother and spoke about the Mary Celeste, stating, "Our vessel is in beautiful trim, and I hope we shall have a fine passage." 8 days after the Mary Celeste set sail, another ship called the De Gratia launched from New York and followed the same route. While near the Portuguese islands of the Azores, Captain David Morehouse of the De Gratia was told that a vessel had been sighted about 6 miles away, and when no reply signals came from the ship, a few men were sent to investigate. Searchers from the De Gratia found that the mystery ship was the Mary Celeste in a disheveled but seaworthy condition with the lifeboat missing and no sign of the crew. Many theories about what happened to the crew of the Mary Celeste, including the possibility of a pirate raid and even a giant squid attack, exist, but the true answer will likely remain a mystery forever. One of the most famous rooms in the world was relocated on 3 separate occasions, but after the last, it was never seen again. In 1701, construction on the Amber Room began and was intended to be installed at Charlottenburg Palace, which is now in modern-day Berlin. The intricate and priceless Amber Room was designed by German sculptor Andreas Schlüter, and as the name suggests, it was adorned with ornate amber panels as well as gold leaf and mirrors. Despite original intentions, the Amber Room was instead fitted in Berlin City Palace before once again moving to Russia, forming a sort of alliance between the countries. Following the outbreak of World War II, during the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the curators of the Amber Room attempted to dismantle it for safekeeping, but failed and instead attempted to hide it behind wallpaper. Despite the attempts to hide it, the Amber Room was dismantled by Nazi forces and was relocated back to Königsberg Castle, which was later attacked by the Royal Air Force. It is unknown if the Amber Room survived the Allied attack on Königsberg, though many theorists and eyewitnesses claim that the Amber Room still exists somewhere. On this day in 1215, quite possibly one of the most important documents in history was created. Magna Carta, meaning Great Charter, was an agreement of rights between the barons and King John of England, who was considered by some to have been the worst English monarch. Known for his barbaric methods, King John was infamous for starving his opponents to death, imprisoning his former wife, and murdering his own nephew, but seemingly worst of all were his heavily enforced high taxes. In retaliation to the unfairness, the English barons demanded that the king obey the law, but when he refused, the barons captured London and King John was forced to negotiate. The two sides met at Runnymede, where the negotiations ended with the formation of the Magna Carta. Despite later revisions and further disputes, the Magna Carta has largely stood the test of time, and 800 years on, some of its laws still exist and even served as inspiration for the US Declaration of Independence. No man shall be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or ruined in any way except by lawful judgment of his peers and the law of the land. During the mid-1540s, Polish mathematician and astronomer Nicolaus Copernicus published his model of the solar system that was centered around the Sun, with the Earth and other planets moving around it. After his publication of the Copernican system in 1543, Copernicus died at the age of 70, but not before sparking a scientific revolution brought on by his potentially blasphemous and heretical works. During the 16th and 17th century, the Catholic Church sought to persecute scientists who formed theories that the Church deemed heretical, and even forbade people from reading such works by placing them on the index of prohibited books. Copernicus had died before he could face any persecution by the Church, but there were other scientists who held his beliefs, with the most notable being Galileo Galilei. The Holy Scriptures state that the Earth is at the center of the universe, rather than the Sun, and as the contents of the Bible were taken seriously, the two scientists were deemed sinners. On the 22nd of June 1633, the Holy Office in Rome forced Galileo Galilei to recant his view, furthering the war between science and the Church. During the winter of 1959, 9 experienced Soviet-Russian hikers led by Igor Dyatlov set off up the Ural Mountains and never returned. On February 1st, the group established a camp on the eastern slopes of Kholat-Syakhl, and that night at the camp would unfortunately be their last. During the night, something caused the group to cut their way out of the tent and flee the campsite, an act made more concerning as the group were inadequately dressed for the harsh conditions. Later search teams would sadly find the remains of all the hikers in various locations and in bizarre and disturbing conditions. 6 had suffered from hypothermia, while the other 3 had sustained serious physical trauma. 4 hikers were found in the running water of a nearby creek, with 2 of them missing their eyes and 1 of them missing their tongue. No one knows exactly what happened to the hikers, but many theories have been put forth, ranging from strong winds, group panic, and even suspicious military involvement, though most believe a strong avalanche to be the cause. Sitting silently and reflecting the sun's light from roughly 250,000 miles away is the whitish-grey celestial body we call the Moon. The Moon's orbit around the Earth is elliptical, meaning it gets closer and further away as it moves around us, and its synchronous orbit means we only get to see one side of its surface, which makes its years and days both 27 Earth days long. The Moon has a rocky and crater-covered landscape and is a little over a quarter of the size of the Earth, having a circumference of 6,784 miles and a core of molten iron. Due to the very thin atmosphere on the Moon, the temperatures can vary drastically from being within direct sunlight at 127 degrees Celsius and being on the far side of the Moon dropping to minus 173 degrees Celsius. The Moon's gravitational pull causes the water on the nearest and furthest side of the Earth to bulge outward, which causes the Earth's tides to change, and a side effect of this is a slowing of the Earth's rotation, which in turn is causing the Moon to slowly drift 4 centimeters away from us each year. They say lightning never strikes twice in the same place, but apparently the same could not be said for people. The story goes that during World War I, Walter Summerford, a British military officer who had survived many dangerous and life-threatening battles, ended up bound to a wheelchair following a surprise lightning strike. The bolt jolted him off of his horse and left him paralyzed from the waist down, sparking the first instance of a series of unlikely strikes. Years later, in 1924, Walter was out fishing when the second strike struck a nearby tree through which Walter absorbed the current, but most striking of all was that 2 days later, Walter was able to walk again. One day in 1930, while on one of his regular outings, the weather took an abrupt turn for the worse, and Walter dashed for cover, but was struck by lightning a third time, with this one leaving him paralyzed from head to toe. After passing away in 1932, Walter was laid to rest in a cemetery in Vancouver, where a fourth and final lightning bolt shockingly struck his tombstone. A twisted and winding house with doorways and staircases that lead nowhere, and windows that oddly peer into other rooms. Are there really spirits within the ominous walls of the Winchester Mystery House? When William Wirt Winchester died of tuberculosis in 1881, he left his wife, Sarah Winchester, with $20.5 million and 50% of his firearms company. Later, after her infant daughter passed away, Sarah spoke with a spiritual medium from Boston who told her that she should travel west and continuously build a home for herself and the spirits of those who were killed by Winchester rifles. In 1884, Sarah purchased an unfinished farmhouse in the Santa Clara Valley and began work on her mansion, designed in an odd layout with the intention of confusing the lost spirits that she believed had followed her there. The building eventually reached 7 stories and contained many lavish adornments, but after a severe earthquake in 1906, it was left with only 4 stories. Today, the Winchester House remains in the heart of San Jose, California, and is open to those who dare to enter inside its supposedly haunted walls. Have you heard the tale of an entire colony of settlers disappearing during the 1800s in America? In August 1857, roughly 115 English settlers arrived on Roanoke Island, just off the coast of what is now North Carolina. Later that same year, the governor of the colony, John White, traveled back to England to gather fresh supplies due to worsening conditions in the colony. A few hundred years prior, in 1585, a colony led by Governor Ralph Lane had attempted and failed to settle the Roanoke area due to a lack of supplies and poor relations with the Native Americans. Not wanting to follow in his predecessor's footsteps of failure, John White successfully returned to England to collect supplies, but was prevented from returning to his colony by the outbreak of the Anglo-Spanish War. 3 years after John White left Roanoke, he finally returned and found the settlement well fortified but completely abandoned, and the only clue as to what had happened was the cryptic word Croatoan carved into a piece of wood. The fate of the colonists remains unknown. In September 1961, Barney and Betty Hill claimed to see a bright point of light in the sky while returning home from a vacation in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They noticed its odd shape and that it was flashing multicolored lights and speculated that it was either a regular airplane or an infamous flying saucer. The Hills then continued on their journey home, only to have the road ahead of them obstructed by the strange craft, in which Barney claimed he saw 11 humanoid figures that wore glossy black uniforms that communicated with him telepathically. After Barney heard the voice, he told Betty that they were going to be captured, and so the couple sped off once more before experiencing strange sensations in their heads when they realized that they had traveled 35 miles and only had spotty memories of their journey. After noticing scuff marks on their shoes and tears in their clothes, the couple started to reconstruct their experience and became convinced that they had been abducted by the strange beings and then returned to Earth, but we will likely never know for certain. Greek fire was a naval weapon first introduced in the year 627 AD to effectively destroy enemy ships, and its recipe was a closely guarded secret which is still a mystery to this day. The Byzantine Empire, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire and Byzantium, was the continuation of the Roman Empire through the Middle Ages. Ruled out of Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, the Byzantine Empire had numerous enemies throughout its existence, including the Huns from Central Asia, the Hungarians, as well as the nomadic warrior tribes of the Bulgars and the Khazars. When the Byzantines were engaged in wars at sea, they would make use of pressurized funnels known as a siphon, which could spray the Greek fire like a hose onto enemy ships and the surface of the water, while in other forms, Greek fire was used inside ceramic jars, which were then thrown at the enemy. Many theories about what Greek fire was made from exist, but whether it was made from saltpeter, quicklime, or crude petroleum, the recipe for destruction will likely remain a mystery. The Voynich Manuscript is a fantastical book filled with unknown species of plants and symbols written in an unknown language, but is it a hoax or a book from another dimension? The manuscript, currently kept at Yale University, is a sort of codex that is handwritten in an entirely unknown language system which has since been dubbed Voynichese. The parchment of the book is a substance called vellum, which is made from calfskin and has been carbon dated back to the early 15th century, and stylistic analysis suggests it was written in Italy during the Renaissance. The origins, authorship, and reason for the book's existence have been debated for years, with some theories suggesting it to be a code, cipher, or simply a hoax. The enigmatic book has around 250 pages, with evidence that some are missing, and there are also foldable sheets of varying size covered in abstract drawings of mysterious plant life. Cryptographers and wartime codebreakers from both America and Britain have tried their hand at attempting to decipher the meaning and purpose of the codex, but for now, its existence remains a mystery.